September 1943. The desert wind carried dust and silence across a narrow road outside Bizerte, Tunisia. A convoy crawled forward. 4 trucks marked with faded red crosses, their canvas sides flapping in the heat. Inside, rows of exhausted Italian women sat motionless, their khaki uniforms streaked with sand. Most were nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries, captured after the Italian armistice shattered their command structure overnight. Their faces showed no fear now, only disbelief and fatigue. For days they had been told that American soldiers were savages, men who mocked prisoners, who humiliated women. But when the trucks halted at the gates of a U.S. detention camp, what they saw stunned them. The guards stood upright, rifles grounded. One officer, barely 30, stepped forward, saluted, and said, "Welcome, ladies. You will be treated under the Geneva Convention." His tone was calm, professional, courteous. An orderly brought water and bread without a word. The women looked at one another, uncertain if this was mockery or mercy. In that strange stillness under the glaring African sun, their understanding of the enemy began to unravel, and to understand why, we must go back to the moment Italy fell apart, when loyalty, honor, and survival collided in a single autumn of collapse. The story of those captured Italian women begins not in the desert, but in the heart of a nation unraveling from within. In the summer of 1943, Italy was a country exhausted by promises and burned by its own ambitions. The fascist dream that had once marched under banners of destiny now lay buried beneath the ruins of its cities. Allied bombers roared across the night skies of Rome, Milan, and Naples, leaving behind fire, rubble, and fear. The war Mussolini had sworn would restore Roman glory had instead delivered hunger and humiliation. By July 25, 1943, the illusion shattered completely. Mussolini was deposed by his own Grand Council, arrested on the orders of King Victor Emmanuel III. Marshal Pietro Badoglio took power, promising that the war would continue, yet secretly negotiating with the Allies for surrender. In the barracks, hospitals, and command posts across Italy, confusion replaced command. Soldiers no longer knew whom to obey. Among them were thousands of women serving in uniform for the first time in Italian history. Many were members of the Croce Rossa Italiana, the Italian Red Cross, or volunteers in the Servizio Ausiliario Femminile, a fascist auxiliary corps created to support logistics, nursing, and clerical work for the military. They had trained in discipline, learned to obey, and were told their nation's honor depended on their service. Yet when Italy signed the armistice on September 8, 1943, everything they believed in collapsed overnight. Italian units stationed in North Africa, Sicily, and the Balkans suddenly found themselves enemies to all sides. Hunted by the Germans they once fought beside, distrusted by the Allies who now occupied their soil. Tens of thousands were captured within days. In Tunisia and Algeria, British and American forces rounded up entire Italian medical columns and transport units. The male prisoners were processed for labor and relocation. The women, fewer in number but significant in presence, became an administrative puzzle. Not soldiers in the strict sense, but not civilians either. The United States, already operating dozens of Allied-controlled camps across North Africa, now had to decide how to treat them. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required humane treatment for all prisoners of war, including respect for rank, gender, and medical personnel. But in the early 1940s, the sight of women in uniform was still an anomaly, especially to American officers barely out of college. They had trained for combat, not for etiquette. Yet what followed would reveal something about both nations, one collapsing from the weight of its ideology, the other rising on its moral conviction. The U.S. military's approach to prisoner management was rooted in procedure and reputation. From the start of the North African campaign, General Dwight D. Eisenhower insisted that the Allies must treat Axis captives not as enemies of hate, but as men bound by orders. His reasoning was pragmatic: cruelty created resistance, civility created compliance. The same principle extended to the women captured under Italian command. When the Italian female auxiliaries arrived at processing stations near Bizerte and later at Oran, they were handled under supervision by the U.S. Army Provost Marshal General's Office, in coordination with Red Cross observers. Their uniforms were noted, their medical credentials verified, and their dignity remarkably for the time, maintained. American guards were instructed to conduct themselves with restraint and professional decorum. For the women, the experience was disorienting. They had grown up under fascist propaganda that portrayed the Allies, especially the Americans, as crude, materialistic, and morally corrupt. The contrast between expectation and reality struck them with almost physical force. The Americans were confident but not cruel, firm but unfailingly polite. Even their casual posture, the way they leaned on trucks or spoke freely to superiors, felt alien, a kind of democracy in motion. Behind the barbed wire, daily life followed order and predictability. The camps were organized like small cities: barracks, kitchens, infirmaries, and recreation areas. Work details were arranged for men, while the women were kept separate for safety and dignity, often assisting in medical stations or clerical tasks under light supervision. Inspections were regular, and violations, and either by guards or prisoners, were rare. Red Cross reports later described the American camps in North Africa as models of discipline and hygiene. Water was scarce but rationed fairly. Food, though simple, was abundant by wartime standards. Tinned meat, bread, coffee, even fruit when supply ships arrived. For Italian prisoners who had known rationing and scarcity, it felt almost surreal. Some suspected it was a trick. What truly unsettled them, however, was not abundance but attitude. In fascist Italy, military hierarchy had been absolute. Officers commanded with arrogance, subordinates obeyed without question, and women were expected to serve silently. In the American system, respect seemed to flow in both directions. When a young U.S. lieutenant addressed an Italian nurse as Miss instead of Signorina prisoner, it felt to her like an act of quiet revolution. Cultural shock deepened as weeks turned into months. American military police enforced rules but did so with an ease born of self-assurance. They were confident in authority without needing to prove it. Even gestures of courtesy, a door held open, a please or thank you, carried unexpected weight. To women raised in a regime where obedience was coerced, voluntary respect felt almost subversive. Letters from Italian women prisoners later captured this confusion. One wrote, "The Americans walk with their heads high but not in pride. They look at you as an equal even when you wear a different uniform." Another wrote home that the guards' kindness was not pity but habit. They treat decency as normal, not exceptional. For the American officers, these encounters were equally novel. Many had never seen women in military dress beyond the Women's Army Corps back home. Their conduct was shaped by a blend of regulation and instinct, to treat prisoners firmly, but to preserve what the Army called the dignity of discipline. Unconsciously, they became ambassadors of the democracy their nation claimed to represent. Meanwhile, Italy itself was tearing apart. After the armistice, the country split in two. The Kingdom of the South, aligned with the Allies under Badoglio, and the Italian Social Republic, the puppet state restored by Hitler in the north with Mussolini at its head. The division plunged Italians into civil war. Families were split by loyalty. Soldiers fought against former comrades, and women who had once served the regime now faced suspicion from both sides. In Allied custody, however, those divisions mattered less. The Americans saw prisoners as individuals, not ideologues. Reports from 1944 noted a steady decline in hostility among Italian captives. Many volunteered for cooperator status, working for Allied logistics in exchange for better rations or privileges. Among them were several women nurses and interpreters, who began assisting in Red Cross liaison work. Their command of language, education, and medical training made them valuable. At the same time, the U.S. War Department began shifting Italian POWs to the mainland, to camps in the United States, from Camp Atterbury in Indiana to Camp Monticello in Arkansas. A smaller number remained in North Africa, where they formed the first Italian service units under Allied supervision. The women, however, were generally repatriated earlier, through neutral ports in Spain and Egypt, once their civilian or medical status was confirmed. Yet even in those brief weeks or months of captivity, a transformation had occurred, one that would ripple quietly through post-war Italy. For these women, many barely in their 20s, their first contact with the American military was more than an encounter with an occupying power. It was a confrontation with a new moral order, one where discipline coexisted with decency, and where confidence required no cruelty. In the desert compounds of 1943, they glimpsed the outline of a world that would soon replace the one they had lost. And among the sand and wire, the question lingered: how could the enemy, whom they had been taught to fear, appear so unshakably humane? That question would find its answer not in strategy or politics, but in the quiet interactions that followed, the daily gestures, the shared humanity, and the growing awareness that civilization could reveal itself in the smallest acts of grace. And it was within these very moments of stillness and civility that the story of their awakening truly began to unfold. The desert wind softened by autumn, carrying with it the faint smell of oil, sand, and coffee. Inside the barbed perimeter, routine replaced fear. The Italian women, nurses, typists, radio operators, awoke each morning to the sound of distant reveille and the hum of trucks starting beyond the camp gate. Their world had shrunk to neat lines of tents and schedules pinned to a wooden board. Yet within those limits something extraordinary was taking place. A slow, quiet transformation between captor and captive, born not from force, but from manners. The Italian women had been raised in an atmosphere where strength was expressed through dominance. Under fascism, women were told their duty was obedience, first to the state, then to the men who led it. The rhetoric of Mussolini's Italy had glorified submission as patriotism. Yet here, in these Allied camps, the women encountered a different kind of authority, calm, confident, almost casual. The Americans didn't need to raise their voices or prove superiority. It was in the way they carried themselves, in their easy confidence, in their unhurried tone. At first, this puzzled the prisoners. The young officers of the U.S. Army, men scarcely older than the women themselves, behaved with a blend of informality and discipline they had never seen before. They said ma'am to prisoners, saluted nurses who had treated the wounded, and held to rules of courtesy even when those before them wore the enemy's insignia. In the first weeks of captivity, the women waited for humiliation. They had heard stories of Allied brutality, of vengeance for the years of war, but instead of scorn they received order. Instead of anger they met restraint. The contrast was staggering. In one of the larger camps near Oran, a young Italian Red Cross nurse named Maria Conti was assigned to assist in the American infirmary. She was 23, educated, and had joined the Italian Medical Corps out of duty rather than ideology. When she reported for duty, she found herself under the supervision of an American medical lieutenant, a tall man from Ohio, soft-spoken and efficient. His first words to her were not commands but questions. Do you prefer surgical work or triage? She was startled. He asked for preference, a concept she had never associated with military service. Over the next weeks, she learned his tone was not exceptional. Every order came with a please. Every completed task drew a thank you. The politeness was not theatrical, it was natural. The Americans treated their subordinates, and even their prisoners, as individuals. It was democracy translated into behavior. For the Italians, it was almost unsettling. Politeness felt like power inverted, a strength that required no cruelty to assert itself. Their perception of the Americans began to shift. These were not the caricatures drawn by fascist propaganda, the crude, money-obsessed invaders who cared for nothing sacred. Instead, they seemed almost disarmingly moral, confident not because they had conquered, but because they believed their own code of fairness was victory enough. Even mealtime became a lesson in cultural difference. The U.S. Army fed prisoners, according to international standards, 3 balanced meals with inspections by Red Cross representatives. Italian women sat at long benches in communal tents where guards distributed trays of beans, bread, and coffee. No one shouted, no one rushed. An American corporal even bowed slightly once as he handed out rations, a gesture so out of place in wartime that the women laughed in disbelief. Later that evening, one wrote in her small diary, "They win with their manners, their discipline is quiet, not loud, their confidence is frightening because it is kind." The Americans noticed too. The young lieutenants found themselves watching, the Italian prisoners with curiosity rather than suspicion. They admired their composure, their dignity, their insistence on keeping uniforms neat even in captivity. One guard remarked to another, "They carry themselves like they still belong to something." That quiet pride earned respect. Within months, many of the Italian women were permitted to assist in administrative work for the camp, sorting medical supplies, translating reports, or helping in the post exchange. Trust slowly replaced the invisible wall between the two sides. Yet not everything was simple civility. Beneath the surface lay layers of psychology, politics, and history. The American officers represented a world built on democratic ideals, self-assured, often idealistic, and occasionally naive. The Italians represented a generation trained to admire hierarchy and command. For them, confidence had always been inseparable from arrogance. To see it now entwined with humility was a revelation, and yet, tension still existed. Some prisoners whispered that the Americans' politeness was arrogance disguised, that they were too sure of their moral superiority. Others suspected that the U.S. treated them well only because victory had come easily. Would they be so gentle, one woman asked quietly, if they had lost? But for most, cynicism faded with time. The Americans were not saints, but they were consistent, and consistency in war was a form of truth. Language barriers softened through repetition and laughter. Italian nurses taught guards how to say grazie, while Americans taught them okay. Soon, words crossed the wire freely. There were moments of shared humanity that no order could forbid. A nurse showing an American medic how to fold gauze properly. A soldier sketching the silhouette of Mount Vesuvius in charcoal on a scrap of wood to show where his family came from. A guard playing a harmonica outside a tent, and a group of women humming along to the tune of Blue Moon. Those fragments of ordinary life created a rhythm stronger than propaganda. Behind the wire, the world was still divided by uniforms, but not by understanding. Outside the camp, Italy's war was collapsing. By early 1944, Allied armies were landing at Anzio and Cassino, pushing north toward Rome. The once proud fascist army was split, the co-belligerent forces fighting beside the Allies against their former German partners. Many of the Italian women in North African captivity found themselves in a strange moral limbo. They were neither enemies nor allies, neither victors nor victims. American officers began to notice that their behavior and discipline stood out. Reports filed by camp administrators often praised the Italian women for exceptional organization, cleanliness, and decorum. Some even noted that their presence improved morale among male prisoners who now kept their quarters neater and arguments fewer. The army psychologist attached to one camp wrote that the women, though technically prisoners, have become moral examples of orderliness to the entire facility. This unintended influence fascinated the Americans. It was the first time many had worked alongside women who wore uniforms but were not subordinates, who carried authority through competence rather than command. In turn, the Italians saw in these Americans a kind of masculinity untouched by bravado, confident, self-aware, gentle in demeanor, but unyielding in principle. It challenged everything fascism had taught them about manhood, hierarchy, and patriotism. The shift became most visible during inspections and briefings. American officers conducted themselves with formal courtesy, often addressing the Italian women in the same tone used for Allied personnel. They explained orders clearly, avoided shouting, and gave time for translation. When mistakes occurred, corrections were issued without humiliation. It was not equality in a modern sense. The prisoners remained under control, but it was fairness, and fairness carried its own kind of power. For the Italian women, the psychological impact was profound. Many began to see the American officers not as enemies, but as moral opposites to the fascist leaders who had sent them into chaos. These young lieutenants, often calm and soft-spoken, embodied a type of authority that seemed to come from inner assurance rather than fear. Some of the women later described it in letters home. They believe in themselves the way we once believed in our douche, but their belief is different. It allows room for others. Occasionally, American chaplains visited the camps. They conducted Sunday services in open air, inviting prisoners to attend without compulsion. Many Italian women, devout Catholics, sat quietly through the Protestant prayers, moved by the respectful tone of inclusion. After one such service, a chaplain stayed behind to speak with a group of Italian nurses. He told them that faith should not be forced by government or sword. They listened, surprised that a soldier of an enemy nation could speak of religion without politics. These small encounters were seeds of a broader realization that America's strength, though expressed through power, was rooted in freedom. The women who observed this came to see the polite conduct of U.S. officers not as superficial charm, but as a manifestation of democratic self-control. It was in contrast to the rigid, performative discipline of fascism, where respect was demanded but rarely given. Among the guards, too, the experience left an impression. Some had entered the army skeptical of their mission in North Africa, wondering why they fought a war half a world away. But interacting with these Italian women, articulate, educated, human, gave new weight to the moral dimension of their service. They began to realize that victory was not just measured in ground gained, but in behavior sustained. One lieutenant later wrote in his journal, "It's strange to see the enemy blush when you say, 'Thank you.' It makes you realize that decency itself can be disarming. That decency became the quiet foundation of order in the camps. By late 1944, many of the Italian women were preparing for transfer or repatriation. Before departure, some volunteered to assist with translation for new POWs arriving from southern Italy. Their interactions with American officers now carried an ease unimaginable a year earlier. They were still prisoners, but not defeated. The mutual respect built through months of disciplined civility had changed the tone entirely. In one camp report, a senior U.S. officer noted, "These women have conducted themselves with a dignity befitting professionals. Their behavior, even in captivity, has reflected credit upon their nation. I believe they will return to Italy as proponents of cooperation rather than bitterness." He was right. When these women returned home, their recollections of the Americans were not of conquerors, but of composed young men whose confidence seemed unbreakable because it was rooted in fairness. They would tell their families that the Americans had taught them something no ideology ever could, that power, restrained by decency, is stronger than power unleashed by rage. By the time the last Italian auxiliaries were repatriated from North Africa, the desert wind had shifted again, carrying whispers of a new Europe taking shape beyond the war's horizon. But for those women, the memory that endured was not of the sand or the barbed wire, but of a moment when the enemy greeted them with a salute and a glass of water instead of scorn. It was a moment that defied everything they had believed and prepared them, unknowingly, to rebuild the moral fabric of a country that had lost its way. And the revelation that began in that sunlit silence would reach its peak a few months later, during one inspection that would turn disbelief into conviction, when Italian women prisoners finally understood that the real victory of the Americans was not military, but morale. It was December 1943, the desert air crisp and bright under a pale winter sun. A convoy of jeeps rolled through the gates of the Allied detention compound near Oran, Algeria, one of the many sites that had become temporary homes for Italy's displaced soldiers and auxiliaries. Word spread quickly among the prisoners. An American inspection team was coming. For most, this meant routine protocol, hygiene checks, supply audits, administrative notes. But for the Italian women, it carried the heavy tension of the unknown. They had been told this would be a command inspection, led by senior American officers. In the old order, that phrase meant shouting, humiliation, and the reminder of inferiority. To the Italian women, once under the glare of fascist overseers and German allies, it was an occasion to brace for insult. They straightened their uniforms, polished the brass buttons on their Red Cross insignia, and stood in formation outside their barracks, the North African light glinting off sand-colored helmets and the dull wire of the perimeter fence. From the east, the jeeps arrived in a cloud of dust. Out stepped 3 American officers, their uniforms pressed, their demeanor relaxed yet precise. Leading them was Colonel William Harding, a man whose calm authority seemed to quiet even the wind. Behind him walked Captain Raymond Ellis, a medical officer, and a young lieutenant barely older than the prisoners themselves. The Italian women fell silent. The Americans walked past them with measured steps, returning salutes with polite nods. Then something remarkable happened, something no Italian officer had ever done. Colonel Harding removed his hat. He approached the ranking Italian nurse, a woman named Lieutenant Carla Benassi, and extended his hand. The gesture was brief, almost procedural, yet its meaning rippled through the entire formation. Harding spoke slowly, his tone firm but warm. "Lieutenant, we thank you for maintaining your section in exemplary order. Your record reflects great discipline and professionalism." The women stared in disbelief. No man of command, certainly no enemy, had ever thanked them for obedience, much less for dignity. They expected interrogation. Instead, they received acknowledgement. The act was small, yet in the moral architecture of war, it was revolutionary. The inspection continued. Harding walked the rows of bunks, noting the meticulous cleanliness, the folded sheets, the small devotional cards tucked beside pillows. He asked about food supplies, water, medical access. Each question was practical, but his tone was never condescending. When a Red Cross nurse translated his words into Italian, the women's expressions softened. One even smiled. Outside, Captain Ellis examined the infirmary, a tent converted into a makeshift hospital. Italian nurses tended to wounded prisoners with the same efficiency they once gave their own troops. The captain watched silently for a while before addressing them through an interpreter. "You serve your patients well. You honor your profession." It was not flattery. It was recognition, the kind that bypassed politics and went straight to humanity. The women nodded, some hiding their emotion behind formality. In their world, discipline was survival, but respect was rare. To be seen as equals in competence by the very men they had been told were barbarians was more disorienting than defeat itself. As the day wore on, the inspection took on an almost ceremonial rhythm. The Americans examined records, checked stores, and then, unexpectedly, invited the senior Italian personnel to share coffee under a canvas awning. Chairs were brought out. Enlisted guards stepped back, creating a circle of calm amid the hum of the camp. It was a scene almost unimaginable months earlier, enemy officers and female prisoners sitting together, speaking across language barriers with gestures and fragments of English and Italian. The Americans poured coffee from dented tin kettles. Someone produced a small box of cigarettes, passing it politely around the group. One of the American lieutenants, noticing the women's hesitation, smiled and said, "Please, take one. It's just coffee and talk, not interrogation." The translator relayed the words, and a ripple of laughter broke the tension. For the first time since captivity, the Italian women allowed themselves to relax. Their posture eased. Conversation emerged haltingly. They asked questions about families, about the war, about the weather in America. The young lieutenant answered with sincerity, his tone free of arrogance. He spoke of home, of a mother in Kansas, of snow and rivers and music on the radio. To the women who had grown up under the rigid scripts of propaganda, it felt as if they were speaking with a different kind of soldier altogether, one who embodied authority without cruelty, command without ego. That evening, the camp prepared for a small cultural program, a tradition the Americans encouraged to maintain morale. Italian prisoners often staged short concerts, poetry readings, or choir performances. The visiting officers were invited to attend. Inside a large tent draped with the Red Cross banner, a makeshift stage had been assembled from wooden crates. The women's choir, led by a nurse who had once sung in Milan, began softly with a traditional Italian hymn. The sound floated through the still night air, carrying a sadness that needed no translation. Then, in a gesture of gratitude, they performed an Italian folk song, a lilting melody about home and resilience. The Americans listened respectfully, some visibly moved. When the song ended, Colonel Harding stood and applauded quietly. Then, without prompting, the American guards followed. After a pause, Harding turned to the translator and said, "Tell them, they have reminded us that grace can survive even in war." The words spread through the audience in murmured Italian. Some of the women lowered their heads. Others fought back tears. That night, after the officers departed, the camp was unusually quiet. The Italian women sat on the steps of their barracks, speaking in low voices. For months they had believed that captivity meant erasure, a slow descent into invisibility. Yet here, among their captors, they had been seen again, not as enemies or as tools of propaganda, but as human beings. The next morning, When the American officers prepared to leave, something unexpected occurred again. As the jeeps idled at the gate, the Italian nurses formed an impromptu line near the fence. Without orders, they stood at attention and saluted. Harding noticed and removed his cap once more, bowing slightly in acknowledgement. In that moment, brief, wordless, profound, the war between two worlds seemed to pause. The gesture was not surrender. It was mutual respect. For the Italian women, it was the moment they realized that America's strength lay not in its weapons, but in its restraint. For the Americans, it was proof that dignity could command loyalty, even without conquest. Over the following weeks, word of the inspection spread across the camps. It became almost mythic, the day the Americans took off their hats. To the prisoners, it symbolized something greater than good manners. It was civilization asserting itself amid chaos. Letters smuggled through Red Cross channels carried fragments of that story back to Italy. One woman wrote to her family near Parma, "We have met officers who do not shout. They say thank you. They treat us as if we are worth their respect. Perhaps this is why they win." Another wrote simply, "The Americans have shown us what strength looks like when it does not need to prove itself." Such sentiments baffled the censors but delighted Red Cross observers, who saw them as evidence of a deeper transformation. Meanwhile, among the American ranks, the experience left a lasting impression. Captain Ellis later recorded in his medical log, "I inspected prisoners today, Italian women nurses. Their bearing was flawless. It was the first time I felt the war fading from my thoughts. We met as soldiers, not enemies. The discipline of civility was stronger than any order I've ever given." The report reached headquarters in Algiers, where it was quietly circulated as an example of model engagement with non-combatant POW personnel. It was bureaucratic language for something far more profound, a victory of behavior over brutality. Months later, when many of those same women were transferred for repatriation through neutral Spain, they passed once more under American supervision. This time there was no fear, only gratitude. At the port of embarkation, an American sergeant handed out blankets and small packets of rations for the journey. As the women boarded, some paused to shake his hand. One said in broken English, "You are good men. We will tell our sons." The sergeant, embarrassed, only smiled and saluted. When the ships departed, the women lined the rails, watching the American flag fluttering at the dock. For a long time no one spoke. Then one of them whispered, "Perhaps this is what victory looks like, not the roar of guns, but the quiet of respect." Back in the camp, the memory of that day lingered. The American Guard spoke of it often, the inspection where everything felt different, where the air had seemed cleaner somehow. One private wrote to his fiancée, "It's strange. You don't expect to feel proud of being decent, but maybe that's the real test of who we are." Years later, historians would find similar notes across the archives, scattered reports, forgotten letters, small anecdotes tucked between casualty figures and logistics records. None of them made headlines, but together they formed a portrait of a quiet revolution, one that took place not on battlefields, but in the moral landscape of captivity. For the Italian women who lived through it, the lesson would outlast the war. Their diaries, recovered decades later, spoke not of hatred but of revelation. One entry read, "They taught us democracy without words. It was in their posture, their tone, their calm. That simple truth, that power could exist without cruelty, and confidence could live beside kindness, that became their most enduring memory of the war." In the years to come, when the guns fell silent and Europe began to rebuild, many of these women would tell their children and grandchildren about that day in the desert. They would speak not of loss or shame, but of discovery, the moment they realized that civilization was not a nation, but a behavior. The inspection at Oran became a symbol of that revelation, a turning point where former enemies recognized in one another the reflection of shared humanity. And from that moment on, every gesture of courtesy, every please, every thank you, every salute, carried with it the quiet weight of history, because sometimes the strongest act of power is to lay it down, and that, more than any weapon or victory parade, was the moment the Italian women prisoners truly understood who had won the war of character. When the war began to tilt decisively toward the Allies in 1944, the reality of Italy's collapse became inescapable. The surrender had fractured its army, its ideology, and its soul. Yet among the ruins of that national disintegration, quiet stories of transformation endured. Stories like those of the Italian women who had once been prisoners in North Africa, who had looked into the eyes of their conquerors and seen not vengeance, but civility. By mid-1944, Allied command began the process of repatriating or reassigning captured Italian personnel. For the men, this meant transfer to labor battalions and service units under Allied supervision. For the women, it meant gradual release through Red Cross coordination, as many were classified as non-combatants or medical auxiliaries. The bureaucratic language of these releases was sterile. To be returned to neutral custody pending verification of civilian status. But for those living through it, every document meant freedom, and an uncertain return to a homeland barely recognizable. The first group of Italian women prisoners left North Africa in the spring of 1944. They were transported to ports along the Algerian coast, Algiers, Oran, and Beaune, where Red Cross ships bearing neutral markings awaited. Each prisoner carried a small canvas satchel marked with their identification number, a blanket, and a few American rations for the voyage. For many, it was the first time they had eaten chocolate or canned fruit in years. The Americans watched them board in silence, offering parting gestures, a handshake, a salute, a quiet good luck. And for the women, those gestures were not forgotten. When they arrived back in southern Italy, now under Allied control, they stepped into a nation broken beyond recognition. Naples was a skeleton of its former self, its streets cratered by bombing, its harbor filled with the twisted remains of ships. Refugees filled the roads, children begged by the ruins of cathedrals. The fascist slogans that once promised glory now hung in tatters, and everywhere there was hunger, not only for food but for meaning. For the returning women, the contrast between what they had left behind and what they had seen in captivity was profound. They had witnessed the discipline of democracy, the decency of professionalism, and the quiet confidence of men who treated authority not as domination, but as duty. Back home, they found a society still haunted by hierarchy and fear. Yet among them stirred a quiet conviction that things could be different. Some of them found work in the newly reorganized Croce Rossa Italiana, this time under Allied oversight. They applied the standards they had observed in the camps: order without cruelty, command without arrogance. Others joined local hospitals, teaching nurses to treat even the poorest with the same respect once reserved for officers. They spoke softly of the Americans, not as liberators in a political sense, but as examples of character. In private circles, they told stories that sounded almost mythical to their neighbors, of American officers who saluted enemy nurses, of guards who said please, of inspections conducted without humiliation. At first, few believed them. The idea that civility could survive war seemed naive. But as Italy's democracy began to take root in 1946, those stories spread, whispered reminders that there was another way to wield power. The American military, too, took note. Reports from the North African camps were archived in the War Department's files under the heading Italian POW Conduct, North African Sector. The evaluations praised the discipline and cooperation of Italian women prisoners, crediting them with maintaining morale and efficiency in their compounds. The Red Cross issued follow-up summaries noting the extraordinary rapport between American officers and Italian female personnel, a rare occurrence in wartime detainment. For the U.S. Army, it was validation of a principle already taking shape in its military ethos, that humane treatment was not weakness, but strategy. Eisenhower's insistence on decency had paid dividends. Morale was higher, escapes fewer, and intelligence gathering more reliable. The same logic that had once governed simple politeness was now recognized as operational advantage. Yet beyond the memos and reports, something more human lingered, the realization that war had revealed not only destruction but character. For the Americans who had stood at those fences, the memory of the Italian nurses and clerks remained vivid long after the shooting stopped. Many wrote home about them. Some kept photographs, tiny mementos of humanity in uniform. In 1945, as the Allied forces entered northern Italy, the women who had once been POWs watched from afar, now free, but forever changed. Mussolini's puppet state, the Italian Social Republic, collapsed in April. His body, alongside that of his mistress Clara Petacci, hung in the streets of Milan, a grotesque epilogue to a regime that had glorified violence. For the women who had lived through that ideology, the sight was both vindication and sorrow. They had served under a flag that demanded obedience at any cost. Yet their captivity had shown them something deeper, that true strength lies not in forcing obedience but in earning respect. The Americans, through simple acts of courtesy, had shattered the myth that authority must be cruel to command loyalty. And so, in the rebuilding of Italy, these women became quiet carriers of a new moral code. They taught their children that pride should be tempered with humility, that confidence should never silence kindness, and that the worth of a nation is measured not in conquest, but in character. Historians would later call this the moral turning point of Italian wartime consciousness, the subtle but profound shift from ideology to integrity. It was not born in parliament or battlefield speeches, but in the mundane rhythms of a detention camp where decency had become the unexpected victor. In post-war memoirs, a few of the women left written reflections. One, Lucia Ferrara, a former radio operator, recalled, "We had expected punishment, but they gave us order. We had expected scorn, but they gave us dignity. And in that they defeated everything we had been taught." Another, Carla Benassi, the nurse whom Colonel Harding had saluted, wrote years later in a letter to an Italian newspaper, "It was not their wealth that impressed us, nor their machines, nor their uniforms. It was their calm, their politeness. They were men who could afford to be gentle because they were strong. We understood then that the future belonged to such men." Her words, printed in 1952, resonated with a generation of Italians trying to reconcile their identity after 2 decades of dictatorship. In the United States, the story of the Italian women prisoners faded quietly into the archives, overshadowed by the grand narratives of victory and liberation. Yet among those who had served in the North African theater, the memory endured. Veterans of the military police corps often spoke of those months as a moral education. One recalled decades later, "We went there to win a war. Instead, we learned how not to lose our humanity." It became an unspoken legacy of the American presence abroad, that the moral victory of World War II was as much about conduct as conquest. Back in Italy, the post-war years were marked by famine, reconstruction, and reckoning. The women who had seen the inside of Allied camps became unlikely advocates for reform. In nursing and education and social welfare, they had glimpsed a different standard of discipline and sought to bring it home. In 1947, when the Italian Red Cross reorganized under the new republic, several former prisoners joined its leadership. Their training programs incorporated lessons directly inspired by what they had observed from American officers: clear communication, mutual respect, and ethical restraint. The doctrine shifted from obedience to command to service with honor. By the early 1950s, these women were mentoring a new generation of nurses, teaching them not just to follow orders, but to lead with empathy. To outsiders, it may have seemed like administrative evolution. To those who had lived it, it was moral inheritance, passed quietly from one camp to another, across languages and uniforms. Time blurred the details, but not the essence. As decades passed and Europe moved from ruins to prosperity, the story of those Italian women resurfaced only in fragments, in letters discovered in family attics, in memoirs written late in life, in interviews recorded by historians curious about the human side of captivity. One of them, an elderly nurse named Anna Rossi, summarized it best in her final interview before her death in 1989. "They taught us how to lose with dignity and how to believe again in decency. That is why I never hated them." Her voice, trembling but proud, reflected something larger than memory: the quiet endurance of moral victory in a century defined by destruction. Even in American archives, the echoes remained. The War Department's post-war ethics manuals often cited examples from POW management in North Africa. Though never naming specific camps, the philosophy was clear: discipline with dignity creates order without hatred. It became part of the foundation for later military doctrine. The understanding that civility is a strategic strength, not a liability. For every American officer who saluted a prisoner, there was a legacy of restraint carried forward. Into Korea, into Vietnam, into humanitarian missions decades later. The small courtesy shown to Italian women in 1943 had rippled into a broader tradition of conduct that defined how the United States presented itself to the world, yet perhaps the most enduring legacy was personal, not institutional. The Italian women, having witnessed a different kind of authority, passed that understanding to their children. They raised sons who questioned orders and daughters who expected respect. They shaped a quiet cultural shift in post-war Italy, from obedience to self-respect, from nationalism to individual conscience, and somewhere, beneath the dust of forgotten files and faded photographs, their story remains a testament to an often overlooked truth, that wars are not only won by armies, but by the values those armies choose to uphold. Because the victory that endures is not the one written in treaties, but the one carried in memory, in the tone of a voice, in the gesture of a salute, in the grace of conduct under power. By 1950, most of the women who had been captured in North Africa had rebuilt their lives. Some married, others returned to nursing or teaching. A few emigrated, to Canada, Argentina, even America, seeking the same quiet dignity they had once glimpsed behind the barbed wire. But all of them, in their own way, carried with them the lesson of that strange captivity, that true civilization reveals itself when the victor's hand is steady enough to offer kindness instead of conquest, and that, in the end, became their greatest inheritance from the war. Not medals, not recognition, but a memory of how even in defeat, humanity could be restored by simple, unwavering respect. War always leaves its marks, on cities, on nations, on the faces of those who survive it. Yet some marks are not scars but reminders, small, quiet proofs that even in humanity's darkest hour, decency did not vanish. For the Italian women who once sat behind barbed wire in North Africa, the memory of their captors became a paradox. They had lost a war yet gained a revelation. They had seen the essence of a civilization that did not need to shout its strength. It was there in the unhurried voice of an officer saying, "Please," in the respectful nod of a guard saluting an enemy nurse, in the coffee shared across a wooden table beneath the desert sun. Those gestures carried further than bullets ever could. They crossed languages and borders, sowing seeds of a different kind of power, one that conquered not through fear but through example. Years later, when peace settled over the ruins of Europe, the Italian women told their children about the Americans who treated them with honor. And through those stories, a generation that had been raised on obedience learned the value of self-respect. The Americans, too, carried something home, the understanding that the measure of victory is not only the battles won, but the humanity preserved while winning them. For in those distant camps under the weight of heat and dust, they had proven a simple truth, that the discipline of kindness is the highest form of command. History often remembers the war in explosions, the thunder of artillery, the roar of engines, the silence of surrender. But perhaps its truest echo lies elsewhere, in the sound of calm voices, in the manners that bridged enmity, in the fragile dignity that endured where cruelty could have ruled. For those women, and for the young American officers who met them, the war's most enduring lesson was not how to fight, but how to remain human while fighting. And long after the uniforms faded, that lesson remained, a quiet triumph of character over chaos, of restraint over rage, of civilization itself refusing to die in the sand.